Jack H. Probst.
Okay. And Jack, why did you get involved with the foundation, or the trust as we call it now?
This is going to take us back a long time. My mother had gone to several meetings where Frank Lloyd Wright had talked, was very excited by him, and was very excited about his houses and so forth, and used to tell stories about what he said to the ladies and so forth. So when I became a graduate student at University of Chicago, I lived in a place called the International House. It was about 6 blocks away. I have to go to the north in order to get any food. So if I work at the library, I'd go home, dump my books, and go out and trudge down 6 blocks to the north. 1 block or 2 blocks, I cannot remember. I think it's 1 block, but it could be 2, is the Roby House. You have to walk late at night when the lights are all on past any Wright house to understand it. You cannot understand a Wright house unless you see it at noon and dead black pitch night, because the lights change totally. Wright plays with the lights. So anyway, I would walk past it, and it's the most inviting house. It almost asks you to come in. There's a quality to Wright houses you don't find in other houses. So as a biological anthropologist, I got curious, why do you find some architects produce things that their students can't produce, nobody else can produce? They're the only ones that there's a quality to a Wright house you can't find anywhere else. You can find it at Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, for example. You see it from a distance, it looks one way, you walk closer, things emerge, you get involved. Wright has the same thing. These are 2 architects that could build stuff that really is intriguing, fun to be around, to watch, and so forth. Other houses, you walk inside, you look at it, you get an idea what it is, and that's sort of what it is. The Wright house, it never stops interacting with you. So I call it perceptual entanglement. What Wright did is he built it so that your vision, your hearing, your sense of direction, your walking would be challenged by the way he built his houses. And I spent time then concerning myself with that. It's an interesting issue. It wasn't what I was doing research on, but it was an interesting issue. So I got a job at UIC, University of Illinois here in Chicago, got a house here in Oak Park, and I would take my kids for a walk, and I would go past the Hurtley house. Now the Hurtley house is just like the Roby house. Different shape, but that same, at night you turn on the lights, it looks totally different than during the day. The whole thing is a different perception. So I said, well, you know, gee, that's a wonderful place. And my father had Parkinson at the time, and they had a house in the suburbs. And I found out that, in fact, Wright's relatives, right after the Hurtleys sold them the house, had the house changed into 2-flat. And I thought, you know, this would be a perfect time to get my parents to sell their house, move them in, and have a house that looks just like the Roby house that I used to walk by, but I was just doing blah, blah, blah. So I wrote out a note, put it in his mailbox. The guy who owned it was named Forte. And he called me and he said, well, you know, that's interesting, why would you want to? And I told him the story I told you. And he said, okay, when my wife has just died, when I'm ready to move, I'll give you a call and sell you the house. He was a broker. So the house never went on the market. He called me, told me a price. I paid him his price, and that was it, and I moved in. That brought me into this area. A woman named Elsie Jacobson met me, and I can't remember where or how, and asked me if I'd like to serve on the Ernest Hemingway committee that was celebrating Ernest Hemingway. I said, okay. And the first task she gave me was I had to get into a World War I outfit and walk around and be a guide during the Hemingway weekend. And so I had to try on the stupid outfit to see what it, but anyway. She said, well, mentioned something, I just bought the Hurley house. She said, well, there's a committee getting together that would like to buy the Frank Lloyd Wright home and studio, so it would go public instead of private, and then maybe be torn down or who knows what. And I said, well, sure, it sounds, very interesting to me. And so I joined the committee, and that's how I got on the committee.
That's a wonderful story, Jack.
You asked for the story. I did. I told. That's exactly
very good.
Precisely how it happened.
Well, can you give us a favorite memory or two?
Remember, I said the issue that intrigued me, and this wasn't a professional research interest. This was just curiosity. As a biologist who studies human biology, I was curious, why can Wright build a structure that has a quality to it, that it grabs you in some ways, whereas all of his students and people who copied him couldn't do it. I mean, you can go from house to house to house of some of his students, and some of the houses that he designed, but his students actually executed. You have to go to the houses he was in on site. Those houses have something that you just can't find elsewhere. Of course, living in the Hurley house, one of the things I did is measured everything, scaled everything, looked at the lights to try to discover exactly what he was doing, how he did it. And in fact, got a good idea about that. But the question then came, did he study human biology? Did he read a book on human psychology? What did Wright do to get the clue as to how to play with human perception? He clearly had some ideas about how the eye works, how the ears work, how your psyche works, how he could build a house that plays with those. So the people at the home and studio group, their first problem was buy the house. Next problem was how to repair it. Because if there was something leaking, whatever, how to do that. Then after they got done with that, they started asking, well, what year should we use to restore it to? And they spent 2-3 years. I mean, they spent forever. But while they discussed it, Bill Dring and John Thorpe were two of the people that I talked to most about the architecture, because I don't know anything about structural architecture. I can tell you a lot about perceived architecture, but I can't tell you anything about the structure. So I relied on them on the structure. And the problem was that Wright kept changing it. So you pick one year, it will look different than the next year, then the next year, then the next year. And that gave me the clue that Wright, in fact, learned from his experience by doing something. So he would build something, look at it, and say, no, that's not the effect I want. So I went back and started to systematically go to all of the houses that Wright had built, noting their dates, trying to tag the ones that were built earlier than the Roby house with a kind of theme like the Roby house. The ones that were built like the Hurley house with a theme like the Hurley house. Got inside them and looked to see what were the visual effects. And lo and behold, that's what Wright did. He built things, looked at them, realized they didn't do the job, and then figured out what he had to do in order to do the next one.
Yes, my name is Peg Zach.
Peg, why did you get involved with the organization?
Well, it's a short, long story. I read an article in the Oakleys 38 years ago saying they needed volunteers for the home and studio. And so I came and was interviewed and was accepted. We had class for 8 weeks on Saturdays, and we had an exam at the end. And I remember the 2 questions that I missed. I couldn't identify the style of the Williams house or the Hurley house.
Shame on you.
Yes, exactly.
What year was that? Was that 74?
1976.
What about, is there an impact that you can give us that you feel that this has had on your life?
Yes.
I want you to pause for just a second after I say that.
Pause and refreshes. The home and studio has had a great impact on my life. It opened up a whole new world to me. I had no knowledge of architecture or Frank Lloyd Wright or his contemporaries, and I have felt that I have benefited more by learning all these new things about architecture. It's been a joy to be a volunteer at the Home and Studio and at Unity Temple. In the early days we did Unity Temple, and now we're back there again. So it's been a pleasure for me and an education.
You must have many memories over the years, but can you give us a favorite, one or two?
It's hard to pin down a favorite memory, but I enjoy working with the children. They're so interested in everything, and if their teachers have prepared them before they come, they ask the most wonderful questions, better questions than the adults do quite often.
My name is Pat Campbell.
Pat, why did you get involved with the organization?
Well, it's an interesting story. I was an art history minor at Northwestern and never really did anything much with it, but we moved back to Oak Park in 1974. I had two little kids and lived in South Oak Park. And it was just around the time when they finalized the purchase of the property. And I was reading the Oak Leaves one day, and there was a little thing, and they were looking for volunteers. I said, well, you know, that might be something I could do. And so I showed up, went through the training, and I've been doing it ever since. So except for a couple years off for business and other reasons, I've been doing it since 1975.
That's actually the same answer that Peg Zek just gave. Okay. She saw the ad in the Oak Leaves.
Yeah, well, you know, good old Oak Leaves.
Yeah. Again, I want you to just pause for just a second after I ask the question.
Okay.
What impact would you say that this has had on your life?
Well, I think the major impact really came after I retired, and when I came up with the idea of writing a book about the Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in Oak Park and River Forest, which I did in collaboration with the Trust. And since then I've done 3 other books, so it's really created for me, my interest in architecture and particularly Wright, has created for me a whole new second career, if you will, in my retirement, and I'm working on book number 5 now. So it's really been very fulfilling for me, and it all started really with the home studio.
And can you give us a favorite memory or two, if you have one?
The memories are interesting. You know, I've had so many. I mean, I think that in the first years, I scheduled and led the group that did Unity Temple and the walking tour, because back early on, we were also responsible for Unity Temple. And that relationship went on hiatus for a while, and now, of course, we're back doing that, and I'm volunteering there as well. So I scheduled that for many years, and I can remember days when it was 0 or below 0, and we had the walking tour to bring up people up here, and I would be talking in the howling winds and snow to 40 people all by myself. It was pretty well ill-organized, if you will. The other interesting memory about those years was the fact that when I show up at Unity Temple, for which I had a key for many years, I also had a key to a little closet where there was a little envelope with some change and tickets in it. So I would go there and I'd get the envelope and put the money in, and I'd drop it off here. So things slowly got more professional as the years went on. So those early memories are really priceless of the ad hoc nature of what we did here.
Susan Brichek.
And Susan, why did you first get involved with the organization?
I lived across the alley from Carla Lynn. I had quit my job because I was pregnant, and I worked with children who were very big, and they were severely and profoundly mentally challenged adults who tended to get upset and take swings at you. So I thought I would not work anymore for the safety of the child. And Carla couldn't believe that I wasn't doing anything. And of course, they had just started, you know, opened the home studio for tours in July of '74. So November of '74, I started. That was how because Carla, basically, that's how she got half the neighborhood involved. Tim Samuels, same deal.
Okay. Can you tell us what impact it may have had on your life?
It's been a wonderful experience. Just learning everything about Frank Lloyd Wright, the home studio, the interpreters, people who lived here over the years, the volunteers, the people you give tours to. You know, it's just been a very, I guess, expanding experience. That would be probably the best.
And do you have a favorite memory?
I have a lot after 40 years. Gosh. Of course, they just reminded me out there already. I'm the lady who had my water break in the living room of the home and studio. It was the first day we were busy. It was April 14th, 1975. There was a little blurb, it was Sunday, there was a little blurb in the Tribune about the home and studio being opened. It was a beautiful day, one of the first nice days we had in the spring, and going from maybe being here for 5 hours and getting 2 or 3 people to come through, maybe, they were lined up out the door down the street. It was like Right Plus, kind of, and so I wasn't giving a tour at the time, fortunately. I was looking for change for 20. And I was standing, there was a group standing there at in front of the fireplace in the living room, and my water broke. So I ran to there used to be a bathroom. We would go through the opening. Yeah, they had opened it up and down the hall to your right in what is now the studio, and somebody was there. So I wound up there used to be a bathroom here between the entryway and the octagonal library. So I wound up here. Then I called the doctor, went to the hospital, and had my daughter the next day.
Who's going to have a better memory than that?
Yes, and of course, poor Lyman, I told him, I'm not due for 2 more weeks. It's okay. So maybe you shouldn't do 2. I said, no, I'll be good. I'm sure it will go wrong. Poor Lyman, I thought he was going to die. He was a little upset.
David Sokol.
Why did you get involved?
Well, I'm an art historian by training, and although my field was American art, not architecture, I lived in Oak Park, as I still do, and I read about these people who were just getting a hold of the building from Mrs. Nooker, and it sounded interesting. Came over on one of the Saturdays when wood was being stripped, measurements were being taken, and got involved.
Perfect. So, can you tell us what impact your involvement may have had on your life?
Well, actually, I became much more involved in architecture, which had been something only of the most avocational interest to me. I ended up writing a book on Unity Temple after getting involved with Unity Temple Restoration Foundation after I came off a term on the Oak Park Village Board, and then broadly into the architecture of the community, and I'm one of the authors of the Guide to the Frank Lloyd Wright Historic District, and later a history of Oak Park. Well, I think the most exciting thing for many of us was when they discovered the compression rings holding the balcony and the area above it, and that no one really knew. Suspected it was there, knew it was there, but no one knew where it was. And the unveiling of that was just an exciting moment. One of the things where I hopefully helped have a little impact here is that I was chairing the Department of Art History at U of I Chicago, and we discovered we had a whole pile of furniture by Wright that had come from the Morey studio, and though we knew it did not come from this building originally, it helped provide furniture to be around the building for the first, at least 20 years some little plant stands, some benches, some chairs, these little wooden things with green cushions, and they were here, you know, as part of it for a long time.
I'm Lois Hall Merrill.
And Lois, why did you get involved?
I had been a tenant here in the apartment over the home. It was the second floor of the house. So the playroom, I was just there, was our living room. And there were two women in the front bedroom, which was all one room at that time. Didn't have a divider. And two of us used the south bedroom, Catherine's room, as their bedroom. And we shared the kitchen, which was in the smaller bedroom. There were no murals in that room at all. And at that time, I think maybe it's still possible, we could look out that window and look into this room. I think you still can. I didn't check that out. And so I hadn't known much about Frank Lloyd Wright. I heard him speak at the University of Minnesota once when I was a student there, so the name had a resonance. And then I was reading up on him because I'm living in the house. So I had done a fair amount of background study out of my own interest. And so I was married and raising children, and we moved back into Oak Park in '68. And I married my husband from this house in '61. And in '68 we got a home here. We had been living in another suburb. And when I read about the acquisition of this building, I was really excited, like a lot of people in the community. So I immediately volunteered. And they let me guide tours just because I could. And I could talk about how the building had been used as a six-flat. There was some rumor that it had been a rooming house, and that offended me because imagine, and I used to say this in my tours, adaptive reuse. There were 6 apartments in this building. Everyone had a private entrance, and everyone had a fireplace except one. I don't think there was a fireplace in the apartment above the garage. But all the rest of us had it. And this was Mrs. Nooker's home. And I think this was being used as a bedroom at that time. And she was our landlord, and she's the woman they purchased the building from. So there are many stories about her. I'm sure you've talked to John Thorpe, and he has Mrs. Nooker stories that won't quit.
Wonderful. Do you have a favorite memory? From living here, you probably have many favorite memories from that time, but can you give us a favorite memory or two?
I really, really enjoyed doing the tours. And then I really enjoyed doing the walking tour. And then I had 1 or 2 bus tours. I didn't do those all the time. I don't think we did that many, at least not, I didn't. I had ended up selling real estate, so I'm talking about my time and how I was busy, but that's not the point. Good memories. Living here was one of them, for certain. Doing tours was another. And in the very beginning, I have this memory of having a key. I locked the place up. I still can't believe anybody left me with that key to lock the place up. Where somebody had already locked up this section, and I was leaving from the house, and out on Forest Avenue there was a car, and it was John Lloyd Wright's widow, John Lloyd's son, the grandson, Frank Lloyd Wright's grandson, not his son. And this was her. She was there with her family, and we had locked up, and she said, you know, these are so-and-so, I don't remember the names or anything. Would you show us the house? And I said, well, sure. So I went back and opened the house and took them around.
I began working on the Frank Lloyd Wright home and studio out of passion for saving Oak Park, which was seriously run down and having a hard time. We'd lost a whole street of the auto industry and half a temple full of Jewish people, or a full temple of Jewish people, and we were looking to the future. What would the future be? And the future clearly was Look to your roots to create your future. And so we did. And when I got involved was when the Frank Lloyd Wright home and studio went on the market. Well, actually, maybe a little bit before, but that was a very big time. $400,000 might have been $400 million today, because we didn't have the capacity to raise that kind of money. And because we got quickly involved with the National Trust, which is another whole wonderful story, we learned that the Musée d'Orsay in process had been offered the opportunity to purchase the art glass ceiling in the front hall of the studio. There was a sheikh who was interested in buying the playroom. I was on the Landmarks Commission, and I called Bob Varnes of the village board, who was our liaison, and said, "Oh my God, do something!" And Jim McClure, who was president of the village, called a board meeting that night, and by 3 in the morning there was a writ of eminent domain signed by a judge and a 24-hour police guard on that building. If that one single hammer or chisel had have been seen coming or going, the writ would have been served. We were asked to step back, and Art Loreplogo, the most gracious, generous, wonderful man you could imagine, went in to talk to Mrs. Nooker about finding a price that would be agreeable to purchase the property. So he was successful, and what was interesting was while I began in a passion to save Oak Park, I quickly learned a passion for what Wright was trying to accomplish and the spirituality of his architecture and what he was all about. And that became the driving force for me and for many others to acquire the home and studio.
Hi, I'm Jack Lesniak. I got involved with the home and studio back in the fall of '74. A friend of ours that we knew told me about the startup of this organization, and being a very young architect at the time, I found it interesting and decided to come over and see what I could do. I really had no real background about Frank Lloyd Wright except for the usual 1-hour course in modern history that most architects get at the time. Although that course was taught to me by a man named Herman Punt, who was a professor at the University of Illinois at the Circle, and he was very enthusiastic about Wright at the time, and he actually organized a tour to the home and studio while I was in school, and so there was a memory of being here in Oak Park and seeing the home and studio when Mrs. Nooker was here, actually. And so when the opportunity came up to volunteer, I knew something about the building. I knew where it was, at least it was in Oak Park. Around that time, we also, I was married, and we had our second child, a daughter, and unfortunately she was handicapped, and the diagnosis meant that she needed some therapy that she could get here in Oak Park at Easter Seals, which was on Madison Street. So we were living in Chicago at the time, and my wife was making daily excursions to Oak Park to do go to Easter Seals with my daughter. And then we thought about moving, so it became very clear that we ought to move to Oak Park, and that was in 1976. So I've been here since then, almost 40 years. We did move into Oak Park. I raised 5 children here, and we liked the way the village was handling the diversity problem and how things were making this community really seem like a real village for us. And I could see over the years that my the involvement that I had with the Home and Studio and Frank Lloyd Wright really helped the village grow and stay what it is. I think it was a very positive part of how the village maintained their diversity and their high tax level over the years. It was good to be part of that, and still is. One of the things that was interesting to me that I seem to remember quite vividly was helping to dismantle the brick wall between the home and the studio way back. I think it was probably in the late 80s or mid 80s. And taking down the brick exposed the window to the bathroom on the second floor of the house. And as I remember it, the window was still open and he had never closed it when he had bricked it up on the outside and then closed it on the inside. So, and then there was all kinds of little artifacts around. So it was the restoration process was, and I'm sure John or Don will say the same thing, that the whole thing was sort of a archaeology project, almost a mystery, finding bits and pieces and trying to figure out what things meant when you found them. Some of the other things was giving tours to groups and seeing the light in their eyes as they all of a sudden understood what this whole thing was about. I'm sure all the volunteers have that situation. That's very enjoyable. I've spent a lot of time researching Frank Lloyd Wright, and especially for the house walks. And I've always enjoyed finding out more information about families than they actually knew about their own families. In researching houses like the Hurtley or the Beachy and the Hills de Carroll and a few others. I've managed to give back to homeowners and family owners of those buildings more information than they had or knew about their own family. So it's always fun. That's a mystery for me too. It's a game that you play just looking for information, trying to put the pieces together and making something out of the whole. And very enjoyable for me.
Hi, I'm Bill Dring, one of the early people at the Home and Studio. Got interested for several reasons, one of which is my wife Jan and I had just bought the Fricke house. So we had Frank Lloyd Wright on our mind. But when we saw this building first in danger and then later available, it seemed an absolutely fantastic opportunity. First thought in our mind was for the village. As most of you probably know, Oak Park had some problems back in the early 1970s. And this was a great opportunity, along with the activities of the village. The housing center was terribly important. The work of some of the local banks and other institutions. And we came along in the idea of making this building open and available to everyone and restored would do something to revitalize the economy of Oak Park, bring pride to our citizens who frankly were afraid of losing some of them, and also to bring visitors from all over the world to see Oak Park and appreciate not only this building but the rest of Wright's buildings and the other very great wealth of architecture that's in the village. Other thing that people sometimes forget is the very unusual aspect of these buildings. When a site or let's say a building is chosen as a historic site, as on the landmark, made as a landmark, there are three criteria they use. They look at whether it has association with an important American, was there an important event related to American history there, and only thirdly is, does the building have an architectural quality which would be admired. Well, the Home and Studio together are one of the very few sites in the whole country that qualify on all three bases. I mean, the Roby House, which is a wonderful building and probably a more distinguished design, really only qualifies on one of those three criteria. Even the two Taliesin's together really only qualifies the home of Mr. Wright and his distinguished architecture. They don't make nearly as strong a case as we do because the studio was the birth of American architecture, and that's really very terribly important. I take a great deal of pride in the work that went on here and the work that I was involved with, not so much individually, but as part of a really fantastic team. There were others like John Thorpe and Don Kalick that had played a more important role in the restoration. People like Carla Lind and Lois Hall, who played a great role in the fundraising. And I have to mention John again for just the overall organization of the place. But I kind of worked on a little bit of everything. And it was a great experience. I made many, many friends that I still have. Met interesting people, the Wright family members, Lloyd, Eric, Ann Baxter, and other people, met people from Taliesin. And it was a great experience. I probably didn't last as long as a lot of the people, but I felt after about 10 or 15 years I had given what I needed to, and I knew that everything was in very great hands. It's really hard to cut it down to only one memory. I mean, I remember the approach that we architects took in trying to decide how to do the restoration. That was exciting. We didn't know where we were going until we all got our heads together and thought the problem out. But there were some really delicious moments. Maybe my favorite, since I'm in the studio, was our discovery that the chain harness still existed. Nobody knew what the exact configuration of it was, and since we had cut into the middle of the ceiling and found that there was no chain, we assumed that it had been long taken out. But one day, somebody was digging around and they found the chain. We discovered that it was still working, still bracing the building, and it was easily done. We were able to find out what the original configuration was. How interesting that Wright would put an octagon inside of the octagon. But I also have to think of the excitement of the Over the Hill gang, the Hole in the Wall gang, when we broke through between the home and the studio. We knew what it was going to look like, but to finally have that connection back, which is so important to the history of the building, was a very exciting moment.
I know your name is John Falk, so why did you get involved?
Well, I was actually one of the 1972 to 74 people. I had graduated from Berkeley and with a master's and started that winter of 1970 at Glessner House, Chicago Architecture Foundation, before they had their tour program. So I was one of the first people to do that, and I started the walking tour of Oak Park and River Forest and so forth. So I met the folks out here, and I met Mrs. Nooker, and so I became sort of a colleague of hers. She would call me at night and say that this is a terribly important building, and the national government should take it over. And I said, well, they're talking to the National Trust, and that's sort of like the national government, federal government. And so eventually the price came down from $400,000 in 1972 to about $168,000 in 1974, and that's when. But a lot of us on the committee to purchase, including Bill Dring and Elsie and Dawn and some others, myself, worked those 2 years to get the purchase from Mrs. Nooker. And then then I moved out here, and I moved into the apartment in 1975, the second floor. And from then on, I was on the founding board and everything. So it was, I guess I was one of the pioneers. And it was, in my case, because of my connection, my early postgraduate connection with the Chicago Architecture Foundation at Glessner House. So there were a couple of others that did the same thing, so that's how I got involved.
I'm just going to close this door last one, just to make it warmer in here. impact did it have on your life?
Oh, a great deal. I was working at Skidmore and Merrill as an architect, young architect, and when I moved out here, I stayed at SOM for 7 more years. But when I left there, I joined Bob Bell and became a restoration architect, and then it changed my whole career from being a regular architect to a restoration architect, focusing on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, which I've done. I've worked on some 60 Wright buildings in the intervening years, and partly it was because I lived in Oak Park and I had experience here and at Glessner House volunteering as a restoration architect, and so the word got around and the phone started to ring, and it totally changed my life. And so I haven't given back as much as I feel like I've received, which is good. I'm still doing it.
And then could you share a favourite memory or two? I know for you that might be we could sit here probably for hours and you could share many memories of this.
We'll do it sometime.
Just if you could share a memory or two just for this recording.
Well, there were many exciting times because we were doing something as a pioneering effort in preservation in the United States. And in the 70s, the early 70s, it wasn't that common, and Falling Water was the only Wright building that had been sort of saved at that point. So our group that became the foundation, Home Studio Foundation, everything we did was sort of being done for the first time, at least around here. So we have many, many wonderful stories. One of my best is when I lived in the studio over the drafting room, on the balcony over the drafting room, what was originally the balcony. And I discovered the chain harness about 4 or 5 years into my residency in there, because I was up in the attic and I started tugging on these chains and stuff like that. But the floor of the attic was floored over, so I couldn't see what was below there. So I took up a couple of boards and I found this chain harness, which we'd heard about, but we thought had been taken out. Although if it had been taken out, the building would have collapsed. So that was a tremendously exciting time, and I ran and called many, many people, and they all came over here, and we started taking up the floorboards, and we put the tour, including the chain harness, on Wright Plus for 5 years, and eventually I restored myself out of a place to live. But finding that chain harness and finding the hook for the piano in the back hallway and things like that, wonderful discoveries that I made generally with Don Kalick, and because we were sort of the leaders, later Karen Sweeney too, of the restoration committee and gang. So there were many stories like that.
Thank you, John.
Is that good?
Perfect.
My name is Gloria Garfalo. I am a past president of the board of directors, and I started as a volunteer, and actually it was Anne Marone who convinced me to become a volunteer. I was teaching with her over at Whittier School, and she said, you must get involved. And it took several years before I could actually get involved, because the training was 8 Saturdays, February and March, from 9 to 5. It was like having a master's course in architecture.
And so why did you choose to get involved?
I really was interested in architecture, interested in the community. My husband's a Duper, a dear old Oak Parker who was born and raised here. I'm an import from Cleveland, and thoroughly got involved with the community, and this was one fantastic group of people to work with.
And what impact did it have on your life?
Well, quite a bit, because prior to coming to the Home Studios, we referred to it, I had been a professional volunteer. No pay, working and volunteering in various aspects of the community. And I became a volunteer, then I was co-chair of Wright Plus my 2nd year as a volunteer. We had a point where we were giving all the volunteers tickets to sell. And at one point we looked and we went, my God, we've got 3,800 tickets sold. We've got to stop and pull all the tickets in. And I can remember one volunteer had kept her tickets. It was like trying to pull teeth. At that point, we then proceeded to go through and take counts, 15-minute counts. Jack Lesniak was key on this. We had one right house and two non-right houses to see how the flow of traffic went, and we came to the conclusion that 3,200 tickets was the maximum we could ever sell. And that was part of it. Then I was education, I was tour center chairperson, and when I became president of the board, which was I recruited, I said the only reason I would come on as president is if John Thorpe would be on the board, because we needed history. And he had the history of this building and what exactly. And I remember the one thing when I became president, they said, you must remember, you must never have the stewardship agreement redone with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which we did not. And this was passed on legacy to every board president. And that's why you guys were able to buy the home and studio back from the National Trust. Let's see, what else? Then, as president, I went off as president, and our tour center director went on maternity leave, and I was asked to come in as interim tour center director. 9 years later, I was still the tour center director. So it had a major impact on my life. It was wonderful. It was promoting Frank Lloyd Wright, promoting Oak Park, being involved with the City of Chicago, the State of Illinois, International. We did so many wonderful programs. The International AIA was here, and we had special programs for them. It was a wonderful opportunity, and wonderful meeting and greeting people and sharing the experiences. In fact, one with the International AIA, we had a woman who came in, and I was closing up the building. She had missed the tours, and she was from Sweden. And she was standing outside the studio, and it still gives me goose pimples. And she said, oh, I had all of these courses I had to take, and I couldn't make it. And she says, I couldn't wait to come to see Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio. I looked at her and said, would you like to walk through the building with me while I close it up? Tears came to her eyes. She welled when she came into the studio, and it just, like I said, the goose pimples, and to be able to share with the world this site has been an important part.
When I moved to Oak Park in 1966, it wasn't long before I discovered there were things going on in architecture. And as I got to know Frank Lloyd Wright and what was happening, and going through the home and studio with Mrs. Nooker, I discovered that I had an early influence. My best friend in high school lived in the Irving House in Decatur, Illinois, which was the middle of the three houses. I didn't know who Frank Lloyd Wright was. I had no idea, but I loved the house. I would kill to have an overnight in that house. I loved everything about it, and that was the beginning of my desire for learning more. Belonging to the home and studio and all of the things that were going on and being part of making up this wonderful, wonderful organization, I got to meet the brightest, the funniest, the most creative people I have ever known in my life, and they've been lifelong friends, and that's just a wonderful thing. Also, my family was also influenced by the experience. My son was 6 when we moved to Oak Park, and he's now an architect, and my daughter was an artist and got to work with Don Kalick a bit, and she was influenced as well. One of my favorite memories, and if I didn't mention it, the old-timers would have a fit, was when I gave a private tour to Richard Gere. This was back in his Officer and a Gentleman day, and he was hot. It was a great tour. I had a wonderful time. The other big memory, though, was when I was president of the board of directors, and Ann Baxter, who was so generous to us, planned a fundraiser in New York at the Guggenheim. So you can imagine us Midwesterners hitting the Big Apple. It was so exciting. Edgar Kaufman and Philip Johnson and Brendan Gill and others were on the panel discussion, and well, it was just glorious.